It's relatively easy to diagnose the problems of the UK economy: low growth, low investment, stagnant wages, and deteriorating public finances. But the really interesting question is, could we turn the fortunes of the UK economy around? With Labour likely to win the next election, how does their manifesto stand up to scrutiny? Will their relatively modest policies be actually able to make a difference, or will it be more of the same? The first challenge is really knowing what Labour stands for. They've been quite modest in their proposals so far. Now, the first pledge, you could say, is to provide political stability. Now, this isn't really an economic policy, more of a vague aspiration. But I think there is something to it, because if you look at the past 14 years, there have been some significant shocks like Brexit, trust budget, austerity to a lesser extent, and frequent changes of personnel. We had 5 prime ministers, 4 chancellors in 2022 alone. Taxes have been going up, going down, going back up. So that instability is a factor in contributing towards lower investment. And low investment is definitely a concern. UK investment is lower compared to other countries, and it's a factor behind the low productivity and low economic growth. So to some extent, political stability and stability in economic policy could be a contributing factor to help. However, it will only take you so far. And of course, a lot of instability can be beyond your control. Some of the recent 14 years, we've had COVID, the Ukraine war, crisis in the Middle East. All this can cause tremendous problems such as rising inflation, which is kind of beyond the control of a government. But anyway, it would be a start. Don't do stupid things, I guess. On fiscal rules, the amount a government can borrow and spend, there's very little difference. Now, Labour do distinguish themselves by saying that they will borrow more to fund investment. So they'll meet the fiscal rules, but they allow borrowing for investment, such as investment in renewable energy, green technology, etc. Now, there's been a definite squeeze of public sector investment in the past couple of decades, really, and this has caused a lot of problems which have built up for the UK economy: a lack of infrastructure, a lack of new renewable energy and electric grid and things like that. So there is a case to be made that we need more public sector investment. But if you look at the planned outcome for both parties, basically Labour will reduce public sector investment a little bit less than the Conservative, and it's not a huge game changer. Now, Labour might look towards the United States and Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Now, that was quite a bold economic policy, over £400 billion of government spending on tax breaks and subsidies. And this really did help boost the US economy. There was a boom in manufacturing investment, growth much higher than the UK, and it's interesting to compare the two. But in comparison, the UK Labour Party is much more modest. The initial plan to spend $28 billion a year has been cut back to $15 billion. And as a share of GDP, it's not insignificant, but it's not going to be a game changer overnight. Now, there is a definite logic to this kind of investment and spending. If you go back to 2022, the UK really was caught out by the sharp rise in oil and gas prices especially. And if you look at inflation in Europe, UK's inflation was actually much worse in many other countries like France and Spain. And one reason is our reliance on gas, the fact that homes have poor insulation. So I think there's a strong case to be made that investing in renewable energy, investing in more insulated homes can make a difference in the long term. It's a good long-term project. Now, you could make the case that actually maybe it's a good thing that they don't spend $28 billion a year to start off with, because it might be hard to actually find a good way to spend that money efficiently. Maybe if you start off small and as you gain confidence and expertise, you can invest more and more in green technology. And maybe it's a case that they've been conservative now, and when in power of a large majority, they may be more radical and more interventionist. We'll have to see. But it is also worth bearing in mind that the circumstances that Labour will inherit in the next few years are much more difficult than, say, the 2010s. In the 2010s, we had low interest rates. The bank was literally creating money as part of quantitative easing and buying bonds. The next government won't have that. In fact, the Bank of England are trying to reverse quantitative easing and sell bonds, which will make it harder. So any government trying to borrow will face higher interest rate costs. And this is more of a concern than it was, say, last decade. So it does make it more difficult, more expensive to invest. Now, also interesting that Labour have definitely shied away from what you might call more unorthodox monetary policy, such as public sector money creation, encouraging the bank to create money to fund investment. That's seen as perhaps too unorthodox, and they're playing it safe. But maybe that's something that they might consider in the very long term, but I doubt it. Now, both parties correctly identify that housing is a major problem for the UK economy. Not just the UK economy, but also living standards, perhaps young people in particular. However, it's really quite difficult to solve. Firstly, for two reasons. I think in the past government that the Conservative Party definitely had a strong NIMBY voting bloc, and so that their target to build 300,000 homes was basically derailed by their own backbenchers who are aware of this block of older voters who don't want to build new houses. And maybe Labour, with a younger vote and more people facing high rents, then maybe not that same pressure. And Labour have got some policies on housing, such as making planning regulations looser, encouraging building, and willing to spend some public sector money to build public sector housing. So it's definitely something in the right direction, but it's worth bearing in mind there's no magic bullet to the housing market for a few reasons. Firstly, a lot of the housing market pressure comes from outside government policy. What happens to interest rates? What happens to private investment? And there's a real recession in house building at the moment because of higher interest rates and high costs and maybe lack of skilled labour. And so it's very easy to have a target of 300,000 homes a year, but even with looser planning regulations and more public money, it might in practice prove very difficult. And I know at least one independent report that would say it would take at least 6 years until 2030 to reach a target of 300,000 homes a year. So for the average person on the street, so to speak, they won't really notice any quick change in the housing market because it's really quite slow to react. And even building 300,000 homes a year, which is actually quite difficult, won't massively reduce costs and rents. We'll have to see. So I think that it is needed to build more houses in the UK because of the rising population, but it's going to prove very difficult practically to actually make a big difference. Now, in the recent May's lecture, the prospective Chancellor Rachel Reeves used the term Securonomics. Now, I don't think this will particularly resonate with voters, but I think it will slip off the tongue more easily than Gordon Brown's post-neoclassical endogenous growth theory. He really did give a lecture on that. Anyway, in practice, what it means is extending greater rights to workers, such as severely limiting 0-hour contracts, giving workers more protection about losing their job when they're new workers, reintroducing some union power. And it's really 6 of one, half a dozen of another. I think you could argue that a lot of firms have a degree of monopoly power and workers don't have much bargaining power these days. And if workers feel more secure in their job, if they have more hours and they know the wage they're going to get, you could argue that helps them to be more motivated, more productive. And also, it may encourage firms to invest more in capital to get a higher productivity from their worker. Now, I don't think it's going to be a game changer because, on the other hand, some firms argue it might be more expensive, they might not want to employ people to start off with. But having said that, I think one of the most successful policies in recent decades has been the increase in the national minimum wage. And the interesting thing there is that although wages went up really quite a lot, employment didn't fall at all. It hasn't really caused any unemployment. So maybe these greater labour protections may have less impact on employment than some fear. But I don't think it's going to be a game changer for the real problems of labour productivity, labour participation. And since COVID, participation rates have fallen quite sharply. And that's a big factor behind the lower economic growth, lower productivity in the UK. And to tackle that is really quite difficult, and it often stems from poor healthcare and long-term sickness increase. And I'm not sure Labour have much to really tackle that underlying problem. And in fact, a big challenge facing the economy is the state of public services. Healthcare has record waiting lists, and this does have some economic effects. If people can't see a doctor, if they're ill, they can't work. This has been a big factor for many firms struggling to fill vacancies, even though the economy is not growing particularly quickly. And the big problem that Labour will have, or any government into power, is that Public services have had, a decade at least of some degree of austerity, either spending cuts or spending squeezes. I mean, healthcare spending has increased, but demand's increased even more because of an ageing population, higher sickness. And the problem for Labour is that they've already promised not to raise any major tax. They're not going to increase VAT, corporation and income tax. And it may play well before an election, but after they've been elected, they may regret that, because there really is a lot of pressure on government finances. There's a kind of a black hole in public finances, with the IMF stating there's £30 billion missing, and we've got all this pressure from an ageing population, falling tax and tobacco revenues. There's a huge demand for extra spending on anything from education to prisons and the justice system. Now, they may be able to increase some minor taxes. They promised to increase VAT on private school fees. But this is going to raise really quite small sums. Possibly they could go for a wealth tax, which may be a way to raise revenue, but there's been nothing they said about that so far. So I think it's going to be very difficult, whoever gets in next government, is that public finances are really in a poor state. And perhaps that's why they're doing so much to reduce expectations of what they'll be able to do. Now, the last election, it was all about Brexit, get Brexit done. But on Europe, there's actually now very little difference between the two parties. The Labour Party they do talk about greater cooperation of Europe. Maybe there'll be greater regulatory alignment. But the big thing is they're not going to join the single market, not going to join the customs union. So a lot of the new tariffs and costs that firms are facing because of Brexit aren't going to change. And although it's really kind of disappeared from the political agenda, there are reasonable studies saying that growth will be lower as a result of it, but nothing is going to change on that front. Now, I suppose elections are never the best environment to develop long-term economic problems. Maybe if Labour get in with a big majority, they'll feel more confidence to pursue long-term investment and long-term policies and not worry about the kind of short-termism that to an extent has held back the UK economy in recent years. But the unwelcome truth is there's no real magic bullet. Even if you have the best government policies in the world, a lot of these problems do stem actually from things like low productivity growth in the private sector, limited growth of technology, and there's only so much a government can do. And I think that even though some Labour policies you could understand the logic and maybe it's a step in the right direction, it's relatively modest. So it's hard to see a massive change in the fortunes of the UK economy, unless they just get lucky and somehow productivity starts to rise again. So I'm afraid there's no major good news to offer from the Labour manifesto, but maybe you can't expect too much in an election time. Now, to get a better understanding of what's happened in the past 14 years, this video looks at all the external shocks and policy decisions of the Conservative Party in the past 14 years.